Well, hi, my name is Don Gage. I served on the Board of Supervisors from 1997 to 2010. The 14 years were really great years. I enjoyed myself. I did find out that being a supervisor was a lot of work. So you had to kind of acclimate yourself to spending 60 to 70 hours a week doing the job. My prior experience was being on the Gilroy City Council from 81 to 91, and then elected mayor from 91 to 97 when I got elected to the Board of Supervisors. Well, the ones that I found the most significant was trying to find a balance between the environment and growth. They were big issues starting to come up at the time. More people were interested in the environment and were paying closer attention to things that were going on. Also being a conservative on the board with others that were not. I'm a fiscal conservative, but a moderate Republican, and I found that a little tough at first, so I had to build a lot of relationships with people and try to understand their philosophies and the things that they needed so that I could get the things that I needed. The other thing that was significant was trying to develop policies that work for the people. A lot of the rules and laws that are made sometimes don't always work out because people who come into the Board of Supervisors to see the supervisors themselves, it's always gray areas. There's no black and white. Black and white's easy to handle. It's either yes or no, but it's always the gray issues that create the most difficulty. And to make sure that there was fairness between the districts. There's 5 districts at the Board of Supervisors, and they all represent different people, and it was important to try to make sure that the constituency that you represented was also treated fairly and got their fair share, keeping in mind that you needed to work for the whole county, but at the same time you had to make sure that your district was taken care of. Well, I think that the things that didn't work out for me were very small. I was able to work with all the folks on the board. I think some of the philosophies that I had in terms of, making sure that there were enough reserves. When I started with the Board of Supervisors, we had about $9 million in reserves, and at that time, the overall money in the budget was $3.5 billion. And $9 million just doesn't get you very far. So it was tough to not spend all the money that we had, because in those days, in the late 90s and the early 2000s, money was flowing pretty well. The economy was a lot different than it is now, and it was important to try to keep money in reserve for times when there wasn't any money or times got bad. Policy issues, I worked to redo the Williamson Act and open space so that people could get the breaks on their land if they wanted to farm it, and also if they didn't want to farm it, to get them out of the Williamson Act and get them in the open space if it worked out, so they could live on their land. Because a lot of the land use at that time, anybody who wanted to get into the Williamson Act could get into the Williamson Act, whether you had 5 acres or 100 acres, and whether you were farming or not. And it was basically because they wanted to pay less taxes. And as we started to look at all those issues, we found that many of the properties out of the 3,000 that were in the Williamson Act, some of them shouldn't be there, and others it was okay. And what we really didn't want to do is to turn somebody into a farmer that didn't want to be a farmer, simply because if they're not interested in farming but are doing it for a discount, they're not going to pay attention. And for example, if you grow grapes, you want to make sure that they're taken care of. You don't get disease. You don't pass that on to the people who are true farmers. So I think that was some of the policies that were important. Some of the things that I enjoyed doing was working on the 101, getting that developed into 4 lanes versus 2. That was a pretty tough deal because we had to deal with the wildlife agencies at the time, and they wanted to make sure that we were paying attention to the habitat specifically the Bay Spot Checkered Butterfly. And we had to purchase land. We had to bring all the holders of the property, the city of San Jose, the water district, VTA, who was building, and communities like that, to make sure that they were on board so that we could, do the right thing there. Some of the other things were, just finding solutions to problems. It was a real big issue because people were having difficult times in trying to make the policies work for them so they could keep small businesses in business, and even the larger ones were having some difficulties with the problems. I worked very hard on ending homelessness in 10 years, and that's still moving along. So that's something. And also I think one of the key issues was actually working with the farmers, because my district is the largest, District 1, that I supported. It was 800 square miles of the county of 1,352 square miles, and most all the agriculture was done in District 1. And the farmers had some difficulties because they couldn't get trucks in to get their product to market because of the roads and the situation. And if they called for a truck to haul product out, if they didn't send them a 48-foot truck, they weren't allowed, or a trailer, they weren't allowed on the property. So we had to find safe routes for them to get these trucks in to pick up their products, to get them to market or wherever they were shipping them. So I think that was a significant part also. Well, I think one of the big interests that they would probably have, because the younger generations were a lot different than the older generations. We were more strict rules that you had to follow. Some of the rules or some of the ordinances were old. They were done in the 1930s. And the younger people were interested in change and making sure that their philosophies were met. So I would tell young people that, number one, you have to learn the history of the county and how it's progressed over the years in terms of growth, the balance between taking farmland and actually building on the farmland and making sure that we preserve that, at the same time balancing it so that people could live there also, because that was important. You have to be able to have some development in order to survive, because without development things just dry up and blow away. But at the same time you have to protect the habitat for animals and critters, and you have to make sure that endangered species are protected also. So I would tell them that. The other thing I would suggest to folks is that they get involved in their communities. You just don't step into a job like that without having some experience. And you don't get that just from going to school. You have to, work in an office and try to educate yourself in terms of how things work, so that you know what you want to change and what you can change, because there are parameters that you have to work within. So I would suggest that the more education you get, the better. The reality is that you don't have to have any education to become a politician. But in order to become a politician, you really have to know what's going on, because it can get, if you want to get things done, you have to know how to do them. Well, I know that a couple times, not dealing at that level, I got myself into trouble because I was talking before I was thinking. And I used to get called frequently by the press, because I would always respond back to them in a timely manner, and they were always on they had a deadline all the time, and I was very frank with them, and sometimes a little bit too frank. So I had to tone myself down. I had to think before I acted. I had to be prepared, because they had a habit of calling you at 6 o'clock in the morning and waking you from sleep, and then they'll ask you a question, and you probably don't even remember what you said, but the next day it appears in the headlines. So there were times when I conflicted with them, but I felt that, I told them the honest truth. I did the best that I could, and then I let it go. You can't hold on to things when you're dealing in politics, because what ends up happening is you keep beating a dead horse, and nobody wants to see that. They want to see results, and it's not what have you done, but what are you doing for me lately? And that's kind of the attitude that people have out there, because they feel the taxes that they pay are paying my salary, and therefore I work for them, which I do, but I don't know that they realize that we only get 18 cents on a dollar out of the tax check that they write to the county. So it was kind of nice to inform them of, you know, where the money came from and where it went.
Time on the board?
Well, you know, I had a lot of experiences, especially with people. I remember one incident where there was an issue in San Martin, which is a small unincorporated community in the county, where people had horses and livestock, and the county was trying to put restrictions on that because maybe 10% of the population wasn't taking care of their animals. So there was flies, there was neighbor conflicts, and a lot of other things, and we had to establish some rules on what we were doing with or allowing the animals to do. And I remember at the first meeting we had, people came in with ropes and they were screaming and hollering because they wanted to lynch me. And you know, it's typical, because you start off, everybody's asking questions and wanting to have your head on a platter and blah blah blah. And then what ends up happening is you start to work through, you educate them, they educate you, you end up with a win-win situation. And that's what I tried to do, so that everybody could take something away. And you know, you're not always going to get what you want, regardless of what side of the fence you're on, but at least if you work toward a win-win situation, people feel comfortable and they trust you. Very responsive to the public. If anybody wanted to have a meeting with me, whether it be face-to-face or a telephone call, or a community meeting, I responded to that immediately. And I returned every phone call that I got. I made sure that I followed up. I made sure that when I met with them, I was on time. I made sure that I listened to them, and then I made sure that I followed up after the conversations that we had to make sure I would call people up. I was always accessible to the public. I always carried a pager at the time. Now they're kind of obsolete. And I used to have people call, and I'd call them right back, and I'd ask them what they needed, and they say, well, I just wanted to see if you would call me back after I called you. So they were impressed with the fact that I did that. I listed my home phone. That time cell phones, you know, weren't a big deal. So I used to use the pager, and then I would get to a phone and call them as soon as possible. So, you know, I would get back to people within an hour, hour and a half, and that was only because I'd be in a meeting or something like that. So they really appreciated that. They appreciated the response. They appreciated the follow-up, and they appreciated trying to help them with their problems by listening and suggesting things to them. Well, I think one of the things that made me successful is I had 30 years in the private industry. I worked for IBM for 30 years, and this is my 31st year in the political side. So I've had a balance between being a politician and being in the private sector. So I understood, you know, what it takes for people to make a payroll, what it takes for private industry to be able to sell their product, be competitive in the community. And I also understand the political side of it, where we have to make rules and laws to protect people, and sometimes we try to go, we go too far. You know, it's very difficult to try to say, you know, tell a person how to put a coat on. You know, if you just try to explain that to somebody, they'll never get the coat on, because you tell them to button it up, and if they button it down, they're wrong. You know, so you really have to be very transparent with people. I always ask people, you know, before you do a project, because I had mostly land use issues in my district, I said, come to me first. Don't wait until you get frustrated with the system, get caught up in the bureaucracy, and those kinds of issues, because I can help you. If you're already into it, you spent a lot of money, and you haven't got a straight answer, you're really going to be frustrated, and you're going to be very angry at government. Well, it came very quickly, and we didn't really pay attention to how fast it was coming. We started building. Building was out of control. Prices for homes and property were out of control. And what we really had to do was to kind of slow it down and take a look at what we wanted to do and what we wanted the county to look like. Government is different than private industry. You know, you're in business for yourself and you plan on retiring. when you're 65, so you sell your business and do whatever. The difference between private industry and government is that government doesn't stop, it keeps going. So when you start looking at the issues, you have to look out a lot of years. A lot of the things that we're doing, like the Habitat Conservation Plan, it's a 50-year plan. Well, I'm not going to be around, in 50 years. So it's something that you have to plan for. So you can't just figure out, okay, at some point in time it's going to stop. So I only need to plan so when I'm 65 years old, I don't have to worry about it anymore. You have to continue to worry and plan for what's going to happen in the future, so that you don't swallow up all the land, so that people want agriculture, and agriculture occurs in South County because that's where 50% of the open space is. And you want farmers to continue because they not only produce food, but they also provide open space, which is something that people like. So you have to balance all that. You have to balance that. You have to balance transportation needs, versus roads. You have to have trains and buses to move people. California's population is going to increase, as they say, by 2050. It'll double, which means there's going to be over 70 million people in California. Well, they have to have a place to live. They have to have jobs to go to, but we also need to protect the environment to make sure that we don't lose our past and create a future for our children.